If you abolish the monarchy, I don't see how the Church of England could survive. If you abolish the Church of England, I'm not quite clear how the monarchy would survive.
There is an established church. There's a Church of England as opposed to the Church in England. I've heard some say that it's somewhat of a vestige.
Vestige originally, in its proper theological sense, means a sort of footprint, something that's really there rather than something that's fading away.
And, hardened atheists like Richard Dawkins saying, I like the cathedrals and it'd be a great shame if we lost them. And
does it matter if the Supreme Governor of the Church of England perhaps doesn't believe a huge amount of the story it exists to tell?
But it could be almost worse if you were too emotional about your faith. I mean, what would have happened if King Charles burst into tears because he was so moved at being anointed? It's not been a glorious history. The Church of England has been a terribly mixed bag, but that's real. My hope is in the real rather than the ideal.
Can Christianity be useful even if people don't think it's true?
Welcome along to another edition of Re-Enchanting. This is the show where we aim to re-enchant an arguably disenchanted world, or at least disenchanted people with a re-enchanted world. So welcome along to the show again. I'm Justin Briley.
And I'm Belle Tyndall-Riley.
We are delighted to be joined by a very special guest, Angela Tilby, today. Do you want to introduce Angela for us, Belle?
I would love to. So Angela Tilby is a broadcaster, writer, theological educator and priest in the Church of England, which is the topic of her latest book. I will hold it up for those watching. Good Faith, Why England Needs Its Church. And so today, in a time when we are arguably becoming disenchanted, increasingly disenchanted with some of our oldest institutions, we're going to ponder, with the help of Angela, the place of the Church of England in, I was going to say our cultural landscape, but also in England, our literal physical landscape as well. So thank you so much for joining us, Angela.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
It's great to have you, Angela. Before we dive into some of the aspects of the book and indeed some of the modern questions surrounding the Church of England, we always begin with what you're reading on this show. What have you currently got on your bedside table, as it were?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I'm reading Owen Matthews' book called Overreach, which is about the Ukraine war. And it's one of a number of things I've been reading recently about the war, about Putin, about the background. I like to keep up with current affairs. I need to know what's going on in the world. And this is such a complicated issue for Europe, for Russia itself, for our understanding of our place in Europe, that I'm trying to get my head round what's led to this. And I find it fascinating. It's a terrible, terrible story in many ways, but we're all part of it. We all belong, in a sense, to the same part of the world. And so that's what I've got. And I sometimes wake up in the night and read a bit of it because I've got it on Kindle. It's not actually on my bedside table, it's on my phone. Now and then I have a look. I'm reading my way very slowly through Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, which is one of hers that I haven't actually read, which has quite a lot to say about the church in her day, which is interesting for me in ours.
I'm always fascinated whenever, quite often people will talk about Christianity in the works of Jane Austen, or the role of the church in the works of Jane Austen. And it seems to me that it's a wildly kind of underrated aspect of the way she saw the world and society, and therefore her characters.
I think that's true. I think that a lot of these stories depend on in a way, the reformation, the conversion of character into the better version of themselves than they were, often through love. I mean, There's a kind of low-key Church of England, the persistence of prayer, the recognition that you're a sinner, the faithfulness day by day, which is never spelt out. It doesn't need to be really, but it sort of underscores the whole thing.
Yes, my 17-year-old daughter was reading Jane Eyre recently, obviously by Charlotte Bronte rather than Austen, but she was sort of remarking on how, gosh, she really does kind of go on about Christian virtue this and Christian virtue that, it was all kind of very present, wasn't it, in the authors of that day?
I think people had a very strong sense that in a way, you build your own character by the attention you give to your relationships and your behaviour. It's rather different from our day, where this sort of assumption is, you might come on to this later on, that you have a sort of authentic self, which is absolutely real, and this is what you present to the world, and nobody can question it because it's always right. I mean, I think that's profoundly self-centered and in many ways unchristian, though I can see there are shades of Christianity which might do business with that kind of view of the self. But our forebears had a very different view, I think, which is that, you were on a lifelong reformation of your own personality, which was, helped by worship, by habit, good habits being learnt and then put into practice. And because it's so, in a way, countercultural today, I find it rather appealing.
Yes, well, it's often the way, isn't it, that these things come around at some point. I mean, how does this apply to your own life? Give us a little bit of a background to Angela Tilby and what's led you to the point where you are. You're actually joining us, for those who can't see you, dressed obviously in your clerical garb with a dog collar and so on. What was that option ever open to you? I assume not when you were growing up, Angela.
No, absolutely not. I mean, the first woman I ever saw preaching was a wonderful congregational minister called Elsie Chamberlain, who was quite famous, actually. She worked for the BBC, as I did for many years, as it happened. And I must say it was quite a shock because, there was quite a deep strand in the rather evangelical world that I inhabited as a teenager, which doubted that women had authority to preach, let alone to preside at Holy Communion or anything like that. So, yes, I wasn't expecting, I didn't grow up with any strong sense that this was a call that I could ever inhabit. But I do think, and this came more from school than from church. I mean, my mother was a Roman Catholic, she was a convert, and I was baptised into the Catholic Church in Nigeria, as it happened, where my parents met and married. But when they returned to England eventually, we used to go along to our local parish church from time to time, quite often really. And there was that, but it was school. It was school where I sort of was really exposed to the Bible for the first time. And in those days, I mean, you could get a lot of religious education in school, and the stories of the Old Testament, I found them magical. And I was given a Bible at one point. I was quite young, I was sort of only just reading, and I remember sort of being fascinated by the strange language and how difficult it was to read it, and yet in a way it's also very simple. I mean, lots of words of one syllable. It's not that difficult for a child to grasp even the King James version of the Bible when it's telling a story. And so I was brought up on Bible stories and really value that, having those stories going on and on through decades of one's life and getting to sort of, wrestle with them, struggle with them, find out what they were really all about. That was really important. When I was a teenager, I think I took on Christian faith for myself and was confirmed. Fascinated by confirmation classes. I was very well taught, as it happened, and we went through the Catechism of the Book of Common Prayer, and I remember, really looking forward to the classes each week. And then being confirmed, that seemed to sort of seal the deal. And so I looked for, I mean, it sort of something was pursuing me because I was very, very keen to understand more about faith, and that's what led me to want to study theology at Cambridge, which I did. Parents didn't really approve, nor did my school, but I was determined to do it, and so I did. And then I worked for the BBC for 22 years in religious broadcasting before this was the point when women were beginning to be ordained into the church, and I sort of I'd been doing quite a lot of sort of retreat work for women deacons in the Church of England. And I went to one ordination retreat. I'd been giving the talks, and the bishop who was ordaining the women who I'd been talking to said at one point when he was listening to their declaration of assent, which all clergy have to do before they're put into a new job, he said, "Stand up, all of you." He said, "I don't know why Angela's not standing up. She ought to be saying this too." I thought, "Oh heavens, perhaps I should." So I was kind of called out.
I love that. I mean, what in a sense, you'd obviously been undertaking a ministry up to that point anyway, either indirectly or directly through your television and radio work, and also through this direct way, speaking to deacons and so on. What changed when, as it were, you were officially allowed to become a minister of word and sacrament? In what was the difference?
I mean, I had 10 years as a reader, which is sort of does give you a certain amount of authority, and you in turn owe a certain amount of loyalty. So I was quite familiar with preaching and with with church life in general. I mean, I suppose the major thing was the coming into a more Eucharistically centred, that is to do with the Holy Communion being really at the centre of the church's life. And, a year as a deacon, and a deacon in the church has a particular liturgical role to play. And then as a priest, and that seemed to tie things together, both the sense of pastoral care, the theology, the actual ministry, and to make it one. And I think also the thing about living in a particular place, for me that was quite important. That you are boundaried by the parish system, and in a sense, the cure of souls, I rather love that expression, the care of souls, falls, at least in part to you, also to the bishop, but it's sort of a shared responsibility. And I think that does give you a sense of being very grounded in particular places. I remember when I was the vicar of St Benet's in Cambridge, we used to go round. I mean, it was mostly shops and Cambridge colleges, but we used to go round and the ceremony called Beating the Bounds, which happens a certain sort of late spring in the year, and that was a sense of marking out the parish boundaries, and it was all a bit of a joke. It was a fun thing to do. We went off and dropped in on the local greengrocer and the college porter's lodge and said, "Hello, we're beating the bounds. Should we say a prayer for you?" And it was extraordinary how people sort of respond to that kind of sense of place and care and relationship. I think people still like to feel they belong somewhere.
So in England, there is an established church. There's a church of England as opposed to the church in England. And I suppose I just don't want to assume that all of our listeners, particularly perhaps our international ones, know what exactly that means.
What that means, yes.
Yes, and what that actually entails, and the outworking of a certain church being an established church and tied into public life as it is. So before we sort of delve into any more of the intricacies of it, both past and present, could you just give us a sort of a survey of what that means?
The established church. The Church of England is by law established. That's a sort of the way it's expressed. And that goes back really to the settlement under Queen Elizabeth, at the Reformation, Elizabeth I, which in a way, 1559, I think it was.
Wow.
Not very good at my dates. Which in a way established the Church of England as being Protestant in doctrine, but still with elements of Catholic order, by which it really means keeping the idea of an ordered ministry, bishops, priests and deacons, and of a sense that worship was not just free for all, that there was a liturgy, there was an order to be used. And those, I suppose, are the characteristic of the Church of England. Now, there was the brief period of the Commonwealth when Oliver Cromwell, Britain became a republic and, in essence, a military dictatorship. But when Cromwell died, and it was clear that wasn't going to continue, the Church of England returned, and the same settlement was imposed. At that time, it was very much welcomed, actually, because people were quite relieved to have a monarch back and a church back, and a lot of them had missed the use of the prayer book, which had actually become rather popular. And there was the 1662 Book of Common Prayer is the one that's probably best known, and is still in use today. Not universally, but is still in use today. So being by law established means all that, really. And the connection between the Church of England and the monarchy is very strong. If you abolish the monarchy, I don't see how the Church of England could survive. If you abolishing Church of England, as it were, by law established, I'm not quite clear how the monarchy would survive, because they are very tied into one another. And that goes back to the Elizabethan settlement, really. And you can see in all the kind of oaths and declarations that are made on occasions like coronations, that that sense of nation, monarch, church are very tied into one another. And that's really what establishment means. And there are expressions of it. The parish system, for example, that everyone who lives in England lives in an English parish and has certain rights in that parish. They have a right to go there, they have a right to worship there, have a right to be baptized and married there if they wish. In a way, it's a very inclusive definition, because it's not an opt-in church. You have to opt out of it. You're counted in unless you wish to not be. And so that's quite different, I think, and perhaps unique within the Anglican communion, that communion of churches which sort of follow aspects of the Church of England's way of being. It's something which it's one of those sort of delicate threads in the English life and constitution, which, if you pull at any of the threads, an awful lot more comes away than just the one thing. So I don't know what will happen to that. I mean, in the long run, if the monarchy were to be abolished and if the Church of England were to be disestablished, I suspect that former Church of England people would go on worshipping in much the same way as they have. There wouldn't be bishops in the House of Lords, of course. That is also part of that establishment. But in a way that the sort of Anglican way of being has spread much more widely than the Church of England itself. So something would continue, I suspect.
This is, it was so fascinating. So I am not Anglican myself. I'm also from Wales, which obviously has slightly
that's very
different.
Yes. Well, of course, the church was disestablished in Wales, and now it's a church in Wales rather than Church of Wales.
Not of Wales, exactly.
And actually, interestingly, as you'll know, I mean, it does still carry on in much the same sort of way. I mean, I've been to loads of ordinations and things in Wales, and they're different, but they are recognisably belong to the same family.
We even occasionally borrow an archbishop from them, don't we? You know, in
of course
Rowan
we
Williams.
did. Yes.
We do. And what's so fascinating about the Church of England, and we can be so familiar with it, because it's in the air we breathe, and yet it established the fact that it's established by law. It seems to me that it's both top down and bottom up, in that yes, it means that the Archbishop is running the coronation of the monarch, and that the heirs to the throne would be at the installation of an archbishop. So it's very high level, up there. But it also means that every prison has to have a chaplain, and it means that there are schools, that there are Church of England schools all over the place, and so it like from the upper echelons right down to the most lived experience of most of us. It's there. It's present. It's there. I have a question for you.
Go on.
I have heard, it would be awkward if I don't, considering I'm a podcast host. I've heard some say that it's somewhat of a vestige, the Church of England, and that's a harsh criticism. And I just wondered what you would say to such criticism.
By vestige, you mean it's something that's not really there anymore? Because vestige originally, in its proper theological sense, and it does have a theological meaning, means a sort of footprint, a kind of shadow or shape, which is the beginnings. It actually feeds into the life of the thing itself. A vestige is a footprint, means something that's really there rather than something that's fading away. So
there we go.
Prophetically said something more than you meant.
I'd be interested in hearing your answer to both versions in that sense.
I mean, Augustine, the great Saint Augustine, spoke of vestiges of the Trinity being sort of threefold shapes in nature and in mathematics and everything else. I mean, the sort of paw prints of the Trinity are everywhere in nature, which is a lovely idea. So, I mean, the idea of the church as a vestige, I think, is quite important.
It's actually quite beautiful. Okay. Let me reword it.
And I think there is something in that. I mean, just in a very obvious way, you fly over England, what do you see? Church spires, church, towers. You see churches absolutely everywhere, and quite often from the sea, from the air, you get that sense of sort of communities clustered round churches and cathedrals in cities, and even over a city centre, you can very often see numerous church buildings. So it is there in our landscape, and I think that's quite important.
I was going to say, what do you say of the other one? Because I think we'll come back to just how embedded the Church of England is. But I suppose I took, yes, Belle's question to mean as in vestigial organ, like an appendix
Yeah.
that once served its purpose but no longer is needed and sometimes actually gets in the way and needs to be removed. So is that what do you say to those who say that's effectively what the Church of England is today?
Well, I think they've always got a motive, haven't they? I mean, there's always a reason for saying that, and it's usually a desire for a more overt secularism. I mean, secularism is another of those odd words which doesn't quite know what it means or what it says. Again, we go back to Augustine of Hippo, that the secular was the space between the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ, when, in a way, we could live ordinary lives with redemption behind us and before us. And of course, now it means something where religion has been removed altogether from life rather than the space in between two great religious events. But it's interesting how the whole idea of secularity has Christian roots, because it sort of allows for this space in between. And that's actually quite unique to Christianity. I mean, you wouldn't find that notion of time in Islam, for example. You wouldn't find it necessarily in some of the Eastern Asian-based religions, because it does depend on this idea of time as being the stage on which the will of God and the work of God gets worked out. So even secularity only makes sense really in a Christian context. Because what people mean when they say they'd rather have a secular state is that they either want the total separation of religion and everything else, that they don't want religion to have any influence over government, over education, over the secular realities of day-to-day life. A separation of church and state. And I mean, there are examples of that. In France, the situation is very different, that there is a separation and the two are kept very much apart. But it's an odd separation, because in France, for example, church buildings are looked after by the state. You don't have French churches struggling to put the roof on, because actually, if it's of architectural or historical significance, the state will pay. And in America, of course, another example of separation of church and state, to stop any one particular denomination or confession having dominance. But that doesn't stop an awful lot of Americans being very religious. So what you mean by secular is quite contested, really.
I suppose what fascinates me is that as much as there have been obviously campaigning groups who want to disestablish the church and want to get lords out of the houses, bishops out of the House of Lords and so on, at the same time, I've noticed in recent years a sort of empathy, sort of, a kind of people kind of speaking more whimsically about what we would lose if we lost the Church of England. Actually, even hardened atheists like Richard Dawkins saying, I do like the carols at Christmas and I do like the cathedrals, and wouldn't it be a great shame if we lost them? And there's obviously a huge inconsistency there, given he spent a lot of his career trying to convince people to stop being Christians and going to church, yet he would be sad if we lost some of these beautiful historic buildings and so on. But as you say, they're sort of embedded. People kind of, and I suspect if we did in some sense lose the church, people don't realise just how much we'd be losing in the process. As you say, how much would unravel if you pulled away at that thread, Angela?
Yes. I think also Dawkins goes beyond the sort of artistic and beautiful aspects to recognising something about our actual ethos, about the effect that Christianity has had on our legal system, on our attitudes to neighbourliness and community. And this is very well set out in that recent book by Bijan Omrani, interestingly from an Iranian background, an academic lawyer and teacher who's written a book called God is an Englishman, which sounds absolutely dreadful, really, in a way, but is all about how particularly law, which is his speciality, has attended to the Gospels and to the Bible in quite significant ways, and how embedded in our culture Christian values really are. And I think even people like Dawkins have come to realise that is probably true. And of course, once you start thinking that, you think, well, why do we value these things? Why does it matter that we have a particular view of community and neighbourliness and on punishment and crime and legality. And in the end, I think you do go back to some very fundamental questions about the nature of reality. What is the kind of world that we live in? Where do we get these ideas from, and why do they matter? When these texts were written a very, very long time ago and they're not universally accepted, how have they coloured our life and expectations? I mean, a lot of this is, I think, being worked through at the moment in some very interesting and sometimes alarming ways, but we need to be part of that debate, whatever our point of view is. And I don't actually think that the hard-line secularist view comes out of it very well. I've discovered many years ago now, I was doing some radio programs about world faiths, and I discovered that what we would now call humanism it's actually you can locate it on the sort of far end of left-wing nonconformity, sort of starting in the 16th, 17th centuries, where in a way you gradually dismiss the doctrinal aspects, but you try to hold on to the ethical and communal aspects. And so in a sense, humanism is a good Christian heresy, like so many. It sort of belongs within the spectrum. I used to have great arguments with this with Harry Stopes Rowe, who was the principal of the British Humanist Association at one point. He was the son of Mary Stopes, the birth control person.
Yes.
He was a lovely man, actually, really interesting. And we sort of agreed to disagree that humanism was a Christian heresy.
This is fascinating. It leads me to think about, so as we're recording in the news, and I think it's because, as we'll mention maybe a bit later in the conversation, we're getting a new Archbishop today as we're recording. And I think because of that, in the news has been Prince William, who's the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, and therefore the future, let me get this wording right, Supreme Governor of the Church of England and Defender of the Faith. So that will be his title because of everything you've spoken about, because of this deep link between monarchy and the Church of England. Now, his faith has constantly been something people have questioned, and a statement came from an aide earlier this week. I'm just going to read it because then I have some questions to put to you about it. So, an aide has said that Prince William's commitment to the Church of England is sometimes quieter than people expect, and for that reason, it's not always fully understood. Those who know him well recognise that his connection to the Church and to the sense of duty that comes with it runs deep and is grounded in something personal and sincere. Now, I do not know Prince William, so I have no idea what his faith is. But I noticed that there was nothing in that statement about thinking that any of it is true. And so, Angela, I was just wondering, does it matter to the Church if the Supreme Governor of the Church of England perhaps doesn't believe a huge amount of the story it exists to tell? I mean, it kind of probes at what you're saying, this idea of the fruit but not the root. And does that matter? Can Christianity be useful even if people don't think it's true per se?
It depends how much value you put on a personal assent to a view of truth. I mean, it seems to me that what you need in a Supreme Governor of the Church of England is somebody who's prepared to play a symbolic role on behalf of the nation, and to which their particular personal individual faith is I mean, it's interesting, but it's not particularly relevant to that role. I mean, once again, I think the very way of framing the question reflects our very contemporary view that I have an inner self, which is sort of autonomous, and I have my beliefs. And if they don't coincide with that, then I'm being a hypocrite. Or actually, if you look at the Christian tradition, particularly the Bible, people are called, vocation. People are called to be and do things, which doesn't come out of their inward conviction. God seems to strike people from all sorts of different angles and do this, do that. You are called to be the Supreme Governor of the Church of England. What you think about, that's no bloody business, as long as you get on with the job. I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, of course. It would be very difficult not to have some sense of belonging and inhabitation. But it could be almost worse if you were if you were too emotional about your faith. I mean, what would have happened if King Charles had burst into tears because he was so moved at being anointed? I mean, you don't want that kind of personal investment. There needs to be some kind of sense of inhabiting a role, and of allowing people to both look to you as embodying something greater than themselves. You know, I remember when I was at Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford, and the then Queen, came to do the Royal Maundy service, and we were all lined up in our gorgeous sort of gold copes and things as she approached, and I had this extraordinary sense as this sort of rather little woman in a blue coat and hat and high heels sort of started coming into the cathedral. It's the Queen! So I had sort of dreams of the monarch, sort of, you know. And it was that sort of sudden moment of realizing that actually this was... It was more than an individual. This was a whole history, which is rather modest little person was embodying. And just how extraordinary that was. There's a kind of, you know, Christian paradox of the greatest being the servant. And of course, the Maundy service is all about that. You know, you're recognizing the good service that people have given in the community. And in that sense, the monarch becomes the conveyor of a sense of blessing, a sense of blessing that is, you know, the blessings that we are to one another, and the blessing that that can be for all of us. And I think people sort of sense that. Those enormous crowds that queued up before the Queen's funeral. I mean, that was in a way an expression of a kind of gratitude for a symbolic figure. Now, if you took all that out, and you know, you elected your president, and it was a political appointment and all the rest of it that was subject to all the usual things of people's inevitable failures in office, and you know, the rivalries, and you lose something that I think is quite precious, which is not particularly to do with the individual, but is to do with the role.
Yes.
And, you know, when at the King Charles's coronation, he was kind of hidden behind the screen, and he was anointed. And that sacred oil, sort of, in a way, it's playing out the, you know, the sacred kingship of the Old Testament, and that's made clear in a lot of the music. You know, Zadok the priest. You know, all these big sort of coronation-y type things, and it's not literal, but it is symbolic.
Yes.
And that stands for something, I think, that is particularly English, and I think many people treasure, and not only Christians, because I mean there are people of other faiths who absolutely get that, and the visible generosity and concern that recent monarchs have had to reach out to people of other faiths, I think is very important. You know, the Queen, I think it was in 1912, the late Queen, she spoke of the role of the Church of England not to defend itself, but to open the space for people of all faiths and none to flourish. And I think that was a very accurate remark, and a very serious charge to lay on the Church of England. It was to a General Synod gathering. And I think that's actually true, that Church of England at its best does hold those barriers open for people to feel that they belong.
Yeah, I suppose the question is that looms over all of this, as we obviously we'll come on to talk about Sarah Mullally in a moment, and her installation as the new Archbishop of Canterbury. But you know, the issue always comes up. Well, how much longer will the church remain established? It's almost not when, but if, but when. You know, in many ways, it feels like, and you've got obviously parties like the Green Party, you know, talking about a priority for them is potentially getting the bishops out of the House of Lords and that sort of thing. I mean, it could happen. You know, it has happened in other, you know, countries and republics and so on. So what for you would change? What would we lose, do you think, in the process if that were to happen at some point?
I think you'd lose a lot. I think you'd lose a lot of symbolism, you'd lose a lot of history. And I think as far as the bishops in the House of Lords go, you know, most of them do take that role extremely seriously. And it's given perspective. I mean, I think of the Alan Smith, who was until recently the Bishop of St Albans, who took on the gambling industry in an enormously rigorous way and contributed a great deal to the thinking about the morality and otherwise of gambling. You've got Rachel Treweek, the Bishop of Gloucester, who's made prisons her speciality. And I mean, these are people who can speak from a different perspective from others in the House of Lords, because they are actually located in place in particular regions, and then, and increasingly, by particular interests which they take on board. I mean, Lord Biggar, who's now in the House of Lords, who's an ethicist of extraordinary distinction. And, they are not the kind of people who've done the usual career route that gets them into the Lords. So they're bringing a dimension which otherwise I think would be missing. And I think our legislature would be greatly impoverished without their contribution. And even Rowan Williams, who had very little, in a way, instinctively, he was not an establishment man at all. And being Welsh, he had his own views about the English as well. But his contributions to debate in the Lords were very, very much valued. And there's a randomness about this too. I mean, who would have thought that we would have an Iranian bishop, the Bishop of Chelmsford, at the time when Iran is so much in the news. I mean, you're very fortunate in a way in the oddity of the mix of these people who randomly, I don't know how you'd get together in any other way. So I think we will be impoverished by that loss, actually. It would be all much more rational and safe and just how the Greens like things to be. But no, it's not. It's not organic. It hasn't grown out of our very particular history. And I think instinctively a lot of English people feel a sympathy for that. Institutions are not tidy things. They're not worked out by reason. They grow organically. And sometimes they can grow very badly and grow very wrong. But if they grow well and have ways of pruning themselves and of reforming themselves, they can be of enormous value, rather more so, I think, than things which are simply top-down organised.
That's interesting. I think in regards to the Greens in particular, they want to abolish the monarchy. So like you said right from the top, I don't know why people are surprised that they also want to disestablish the Church of England. You can't have an established Church of England if you've abolished the monarchy. I don't know why that's taken people by surprise. Anyway, I do tend to be, in my sort of nature, I think maybe it's because I'm from the land of Rowan Williams. I tend to be quite weary of institutions, and I wish we could do without them. And then I think, but we can't. So maybe we just need good institutions. But anyway, this is something I think about a lot. But then the person who always quells my most anarchic instinct is William Temple.
Yeah.
Could you just say a little about William Temple? I know he features in your book, and he's who I think about often, when I think about the establishment of the Church of England and its pros and cons. I always come back to him. Could you just tell his story a little?
Gosh, well, he was... Winston Churchill, when he appointed him, said he was the best... what was it? The sixpence in a twopenny show or something. He's one of the few intelligent bishops, is what he was saying in a rather patronising way.
The best of the worst.
I think that what William Temple inherited is something that went back to the 19th century, which was the beginnings of Christian socialism. He actually got onto that line of thinking, which was, is different in political terms from the liberalism and Whigs and Tories. It was bringing in a much more radical streak, a streak which then developed in different directions into the Marxist view of society and all that went with that. But Christian socialism has a long, long history, and Temple really embodied that for the middle of the 20th century. And of course, he set up the 1944 Education Act, which was a hugely important revolution in education. It's also contributed to the founding of the health service. And this sense that there is a universal duty of care to children and to people's health is very grounded, I think, in a Christian ethos of society. So I see entirely that. And I think, to be honest, if you were to go through the current Church of England bishops, you would find probably the majority of them have sympathy with that point of view. You won't very easily find a conservative in the House of Bishops. Remember, a long time ago now, William Westwood, who was the Bishop of Peterborough, claimed to be the only Thatcherite in the House of Bishops, because the conservative thinking for quite a long time hasn't been very close to the heart of the Church of England at all. If you have sort of conservative views, it's as well not to state them in the theory of today. So, I mean, I think it's that Christian socialism is well established, and that's what William Temple really embodied for many people. I mean, he's also incredibly bright. I mean, he was a scholar, he knew his stuff, and that impacted well on people as well. And his positive view of the role of the state. He didn't see the state as something the church had to fight. He didn't see Christianity in terms just of sort of individual salvation, individual faith. He was very, very concerned about the health, the spiritual and social health of the nation as a whole. And he probably was one of the most remarkable archbishops of recent time. So yes, I agree with you about that. One of the things that's rather sad about the church, Church of England, which I noticed was that, and says something to me that I'm sorry about, when Justin Welby wrote several books about the church and nation, and though he was all up for quoting lots of Roman Catholic social teaching, he never mentioned Temple once. And I think it's because he really didn't know anything about him, because the current flock of bishops and others in the Church of England don't know their history very well. It's one reason I wrote my book, actually. I thought they need to have a history lesson in how the Church of England has evolved and what its relationship with the nation has been, because I don't actually think it's well understood at the moment at all. It's seen as something that's sort of always been there, but it's not really particularly relevant and may well, fade away quite soon.
I mean, it's interesting you say that. You don't sense that the current flock, as you say, of bishops and so on, have as much of a sense of the history, or perhaps embody an academic spirit or whatever that perhaps someone. I mean, you look at someone like Rowan Williams, absolutely an academic and so on. Others have felt that in more recent years there's been more of a tendency towards a kind of more managerial style and so on in bishops and archbishops and so on. I mean, what's your sense? What is, I suppose, the role of an archbishop? Is it changing? Is this the direction we're inevitably going to go as things progress?
Well, it is being a public figure, isn't it? I mean, it's an obviously high-profile role. I think that what I regret is that there's very little calling on the wisdom of people like Temple in the way bishops, like everybody else in public life today, are forced into making statements under huge pressure with very little background or research, and they come out with things which are sometimes helpful, sometimes not. But you don't often sense this sort of gravitas behind their statements, which reflect an accumulated wisdom. I mean, you talked a little earlier, Belle, about institutions, and I've always thought there was a big distinction to be made between an institution and an organisation. That an organisation exists for a purpose. If you're going to sell widgets, then you set it up to sell widgets in the most efficient and practical and profitable way you can. So it's a direct line from the idea to the product. And that's fine. But institutions aren't quite like that, because they actually exist to propagate themselves and to carry something forward into the future that is of value in itself. That's the way institutions think. That's the way, great schools, universities, orchestras, BBC, whatever. They think about themselves as being there for future generations and not just for now. So they have a rather different approach. It's not just about widgets. It's also about their impact on wider society as bodies. And I mean, you think of the great shopping outlets like John Lewis or Marks and Spencer, for example. They are organisations, but they're also institutions, because they've all given thought to how their staff and how their impact on the public actually connect with one another. And they wouldn't last very long if they didn't have that. They weren't able to create that sense of trust, because institutions in the end are all about trust. And whereas organisations don't need to be. An organisation, you can sack anybody if they're not doing what you like. It's a much more direct approach to things. And I think that difference is not well understood. That institutions are they're sort of health giving. And of course, the other thing which they're different from is clans. That or you can organise society as some societies do, very much on the basis of your relations, your blood relations, and how this clan of people operates with that clan of people. So we've got a whole lot of different models going on of how a society should work. But it seems to me that the institution comes closest to what the Bible would say is something like the body of Christ, the sense of all the members belong together under the head, that there's a kind of interaction between the lowest and the highest. And that sense of corporate, it's interesting that we use the word corporate because it's Latin for body, and it goes right back to that almost medieval biblical sense that, we are all in it together, as has been said by more than one politician, only meaning it this time. And I rather like that. I think that a society is healthy if A, it isn't over clannish, and B, if it isn't too focused on very specific material goals, but has a sense that it's actually operating. We are members in corporate, in the mystical body of Christ, as the prayer book would put it. So what happens to my neighbour, and what happens to the rubbish tip down the road, and what happens to the migrants coming in Dover, all matter, and they matter to all of us. That's what an institution is all about. And I think that's at its best what the Church of England is about.
Yes. Well, this is, you touched right there at the end in something I was thinking, in that that's so beautiful. That's such a beautiful vision. And then, but what's interesting is that's an institution at its best. What does one do if an institution, you said an institution is all about trust. And I suppose, what does one do when an institution loses the right to one's trust? And when an institution has been around for as long as the Church of England has, and has been on the public square for as long as there's such a checkered history there that must be grappled with in one way or another. And I'd love your wisdom on that, on how you were able to sit in the tension and in the grey, and hold lots of things to be true at once, and acknowledge the worst that an institution can be, while hoping for and working towards the best that it can be at the same time.
I mean, I saw something of how institutions go wrong. Perhaps the most extraordinary case for me was at Christchurch Cathedral, when there was this quite recent problem that the governing body had in trying to get rid of a dean that they didn't like, and behaved in the most appalling ways. And I saw that being acted out, and it was very disenchanting, actually. And in a way, the results, that it hasn't completely healed over, because it was pretty scandalous, and it was on the pages of all the newspapers and all the rest at the time. And I was quite close to that. And yes, I mean, the one thing that Christian institutions should have, I think, is a very vivid sense of sin. Organisations don't sin. How would you sin as an organisation? But an institution does somehow know that things can go wrong, and that reform and watchfulness is always needed. It doesn't always do that, but I mean, they do, most of them try to have some way of being accountable to themselves. And of course, again, this is a very, if you like, C of E perspective. You don't have to look far into the liturgies of the Book of Common Prayer to find confessions and acknowledgement of sin. Yeah. And it's not just personal sin, it's the corporate sins which we all get into. And this is part of human life. I mean, you just have to live with it as a reality. Denying it is worse. The perfect institution would be a very, very alarming thing to be, I suspect. So I think it's that watchfulness. I mean, this is what I think, take Church of England again as an example, what the Church of England is now trying to do with issues of safeguarding, which nobody took very seriously until comparatively recently. Everybody knew that there had been occasions when people had been very badly and wrongly treated children, women, and but it was kind of, oh well, he's just a bit like that, But I mean, that was true of the whole of society. A lot of these issues were not, and it may be sometimes that because it's so scandalous when it happens in the church setting, that it actually, puts out a watch notice on other institutions as well. It's obviously scandalous in a very, very particularly horrific way when it's church. But look in the mirror, and are any of us free, completely free from the kind of issues and misdirections that the church and other institutions have taken? I don't think they are. I mean, in institutions, you live with fallibility all the time.
Yes,
and you need to be honest about it.
Yeah, I suppose the one advantage the Church of England has over other institutions is, it's fully aware of the brokenness of the world and itself, and therefore, it that comes along. And I suppose, I mean, this brings us back, and because, as we've said already, we happen to be recording this conversation with you, Angela, on the day that the new Archbishop of Canterbury is installed, Sarah Mullally. She will, of course, have been in position for some time by the time this show airs. But I mean, that what you've just said reminds us of the fact that obviously her coming into position at this point comes sooner than we had perhaps expected because of what happened with her predecessor, which where Welby kind of stepped down in part because of handling of the John Smythe abuse case and everything else. Now, without going into the ins and outs of that and the politics behind that, I suppose it leads to this question: well, what happens now, as it were? There's been so much, negative headlines, frankly, around the Church of England in the last couple of years. Can simply a new broom, a new sort of person at the top, make that much difference? What are your hopes, I suppose? What might be your fears about sort of as we sort of install a new head of the church in that sense? And what do you hope might be the outcome? Can we re-enchant, as it were, the role of the Church of England in what has obviously been quite turbulent times for the church on a national level?
I think Sarah Mullally has done something extraordinarily imaginative in making this pilgrimage to Canterbury. I think that those pictures of her leaving St Paul's Cathedral and walking that route, it suggests humility on the one hand. You're walking there, you're not being taken there in a Rolls Royce. Also a sense of exploration. You've got to find your way. Also a sense of community. You're taking other people with you. And also walking in the footsteps, towards the shrine of Thomas Becket, who, in a way, fell foul of the monarchy, was murdered by the state. A martyr who stood for Christian values at a point when the state was actually eroding the freedom of the church. I think all those things cluster together to suggest that there are areas of symbolism which she is prepared to enter into without making a great big fuss about it, but just doing it. And I think she's essentially a practical person. You know that from her nursing background. She's not an academic. She's not going to be a brilliant, inspiring, poetic preacher or any of those things. But I wouldn't put past the sincere, well-meant statement, perhaps of the obvious, of the necessary Christian virtues. She knows how to work within institutions. That's obvious from her background. She can draw people together, which at the moment is probably more important than being a charismatic individual. I mean, where I think the Church of England has gone badly wrong in recent years, and it was a problem which I think Justin Welby had, perhaps not as much as some, but certainly did, is that sort of, it's almost a bringing together of the worst of public school religion with the worst of American evangelicalism and putting the two together, which gives you a sort of high profile, let's go out there, let's convert the world, let's do it all through an organization which is pretty tightly organized around certain principles. In other words, it's a widget making factory rather than a genuine institution. And I think that over the last sort of 30 years or so, the church has tried, on grounds of efficiency and mission, to turn itself into more of a widget-making factory than it should have done, really. It hasn't recognised that actually the health of the church is in its different and varied and irreconcilable voices. that, there is not just one way of being Church of England. There's all those parishes, and they all have a different way of doing it. The things that bind them together are not the things that the central organisation might think matter so much. But there has been a sort of, I think I would call it a takeover, a Puritan takeover, that combines sort of the worst of kind of authoritarianism with the worst of bureaucracy. With a sense that we're selling the Christian faith to a largely unchurched community. That hasn't really worked. And it certainly didn't work for Justin Welby, for whom I actually feel really, really sorry. I think he had a very rough time, which was not all his fault. But he was not well equipped from his background to deal with the issues that confronted him.
So what, and we'll bring it to land with this question, really, is to just say, what your greatest hope for the established church, for let's use our own phrase, what ways in which are you hoping that the Church of England in particular, England's own church, will re-enchant our cultural moment?
Well, I think the Church of England has to rediscover its own Christianity, really, that it needs to rediscover its history, its scriptures, its literature, its culture, and not always be looking for the new and the different. I mean, there is talk of a quiet revival. I don't know what you make of all that, but certainly what I've seen in the two cathedrals I've been in recently is that we draw a significant number of single men, often very young, who are exploring faith, who are much more comfortable, if you like, with a set liturgy which they can drift in and out of than the kind of, all singing, dancing type of it's all my personal stuff. And I think that's where the hope lies. I mean, it's not been a glorious history. The Church of England has been a terribly mixed bag, but that's real. And my hope is in the real rather than the ideal.
Yes.
So I'm not despairing of it. I think, numbers may go on going down for a bit. But, where there is death, there is resurrection. I don't think one needs to be afraid of death as such, because what will come out of it it'll be different, but there'll be continuities as well.
Angela, thank you so much for spending some time with us. It's a wonderful history of the Church of England itself. Good Faith, your book, Why England Needs Its Church. And I came away with a newfound admiration for Pope Gregory I, who really sort of got things going by sending over all those missionaries. So 1800 years ago. But but it's a superb sort of your own take on why, as you say, the Church of England still is such an important institution in our national life and so on today. And perhaps most importantly, it is for me that the beauty of the Church of England is that ultimately in the national structures, it's that little parish church that has been open since 1400 and still will, it would be a tragedy if we lost those kind of incredibly important embedded aspects of who we are and what make us the nation that we are today. But it's such a fascinating conversation. Angela, thank you very much. We'll make sure there's a link to the book from today's show, and thank you for being our guest here on Re-Enchanting.
Lovely. Thank you for having me.
And thank you to you, our listeners, for joining us. You can find so much more on this topic on seenandunseen.com. Again, recommend Angela's book to you. And also, if you want to make future conversations like this happen, seenandunseen.com/give. You know it by now is the place to go. But until next time, goodbye.